Let's reflect over a few things. Let's ask ourselves, how many times do I plan a lecture or a session? Is there a difference in my teaching and my presentation and handling of a topic if I plan it in advance? How many times have I digressed in class? Am I always able to cover the topics I intend to, or do I run out of time? Is there a possibility of being spontaneous despite planning in advance? You might be wondering what all this is related to. Compared to a traditional classroom, a flipped classroom, which is a very important component of blended learning, is more planned and better organized. So what is basically a flipped classroom? A flipped classroom, or flipping a classroom, is simply flipping the order or reversing the order in which things happen. In a traditional classroom, the teacher lectures or she explains the input in class and gives tasks to be done at home. Whereas, in a flipped classroom approach, the student accesses the input or the explanation of the topic in the form of a video from any space and does the tasks in the class in the presence of the teacher. So, in a way, classwork becomes homework and homework becomes classwork. In the flipped classroom approach, since a considerable part of the learning happens in the absence of the teacher has to chalk out a learning path for the learner and make available the learning resources and tools to the learner. The teacher will also need to have a definite design of the delivery system, the feedback mechanism, and the means to assess the learner. The nature of the input needs to be structured systematically. In case the teacher is doing video lectures, she needs to decide on the structure of her lecture, the points she is going to cover, the examples and illustrations she will include, her boardwork or the slides she is going to show, since all of it will be recorded and will be a permanent resource and material for reference. The permanent and accessible nature of the input naturally prompts the teacher to prepare herself thoroughly, since what she delivers will be in public domain. In discussing the impact of technology on the academic scene, Mottram says, people are always tempted to try to make an argument for technology having an impact on the development of pedagogy, and in many cases we can see that the use of technology has enabled teachers to rethink what they are doing. We also see people trying to populate this domain by talking about notions like the flipped classroom, ostensibly a methodology that sees input as occurring at home and physical classrooms being used as spaces to explore what has been presented in the input. So, when we talk about the flipped classroom, we are basically trying to reverse or invert Bloom's taxonomy. Now, let's have a look at Bloom's taxonomy in case we have forgotten what it looks like. Well, we know it starts at the bottom with the lots or the lower order thinking skills and then moves on to the higher order thinking skills or HOTS. So, in a regular classroom, when the teacher delivers a lecture, the students are required only to engage in lower order thinking skills of understanding and remembering. Whereas, the more complex skills need to be practiced at home when the student is doing an assignment based on the input. So, for example, the teacher conveys a concept. Say she's a literature teacher who is teaching poetry. So, what the teacher does is she teaches the poem in class. She starts with the title of the poem, the author's background, the cultural and social milieu, the age in which he was writing, and explains the poem in class. She talks about the writer, she talks about the theme of the poem, the central idea of the literary piece, and also maybe explains some of the literary devices used in the poem. All of this only demands the student to listen attentively and receive the information. Now, based on her explanation, she gives the student a home assignment, something based on the poem, for example, like paraphrasing the poem, or perhaps writing a note on the structure of the poem, or on how it is a work representative of its age. So what happens is that in the space of the classroom, the student is actually practicing very basic skills of understanding the basics of the poem and remembering it. And after going home, he or she does the more challenging and complex task. They engage in challenging study skills of analyzing the poem, revisiting the age and context, drawing their own inferences, and trying to apply whatever they have understood in the classroom. And based on whatever they remember, they come up with an assignment without the help of the teacher. Now, the possibility of reversing this order or reversing this practice is worth considering, because it is only practical and logical that students practice the lower order thinking skills on their own, and they engage with their higher order thinking skills in the presence of the teacher, when they can be guided and assisted and monitored by the teacher cum facilitator, since they are engaging in more complex skills. So, this is ideally the essence of a flipped classroom, where the idea is to introduce the student to the basics of a concept or a topic outside the classroom space, outside the space of the classroom in the teacher's absence, and getting the students to work on higher order thinking skills, more complex and more demanding cognitive and study skills in the presence of the teacher, which also kind of ensures reinforcement of the topic, the concept, reinforcement of the idea, and makes consolidation, further revision, explanation, and scaffolding possible by the teacher. So, the classroom time is used very constructively in a flipped classroom approach. It ensures reinforcement of the topic, it ensures really detailed consolidation, and all of the things which I just mentioned. So, in that sense, Bloom's taxonomy is reversed, or the pyramid has been turned upside down. The classroom scenario focuses on the application. So, this flipped classroom approach is actually more application based in the classroom, where a student is putting to use whatever he or she has understood and got from the inputs that they have received at home. One of the benefits of the flipped classroom is that the teacher can use the classroom time at her disposal in a more effective and constructive manner. She can assist and guide students in more activities right in front of her. Since the explanation of the concept has already been done online, unlike in a traditional classroom, this leaves the teacher with time and opportunity to guide her students, pay attention to each individual student in the classroom, and check understanding in a more systematic and a more meticulous manner. Flipped classroom also paves the way for increased learner autonomy, making learners more self-reliant, because they have already undertaken the passive task of listening to the theory outside the classroom space. So, within the classroom space, they need to be active and participative and collaborative. So they collaborate with each other and apply the theory which they have learned outside the classroom through possibly video lectures. Flipped classroom is more inclusive in its approach, and it is better suited to cater to mixed ability learners, because the learner can receive and process the input at a pace that suits them best, and that is the most appropriate for the learner. In the classroom part, the teacher can group students or give tasks to individual students so that they can work as per their competence, their ability, their preference, and she can assist groups and individuals accordingly, also familiarizing students with different teaching learning strategies. Tasks can also be embedded in the video lectures, which the learner can do out of class. We will be looking shortly at such kind of approaches and devices and tools that facilitate these approaches. So, does talking about this approach spark off some ideas? Take a minute and think. Is there a topic you're dealing with that you can flip? What activities can you do in the classroom to reinforce the idea or the key concept of the topic? Your ideas at this stage can be rough, basic, rudimentary. Nonetheless, please jot them down, because that marks a beginning. We often like to experiment with areas we know very well or are confident about or have a liking for. But I have also seen instances where teachers have flipped classrooms to teach topics that were either a roadblock or not well liked or well received by the learners. Why does this happen? Sometimes things need to be experienced firsthand. Dishing them out for ready consumption may make them less palatable. The learner's subjective encounter with a topic goes a long way in retention and deep learning. Think back to a topic you found particularly difficult as a student and try answering the following questions. What was the topic? Why did I find it difficult? How did I understand it? What strategy did I evolve as a student? Or what was the strategy my teacher evolved? Though in a flipped classroom approach during the input, the teacher and the student are not physically present in the same space, or they are not sharing the same physical space, there is a kind of constructed interaction between the student and the teacher. The student has a sustained interaction with the input, and if the input, that is the video lecture, is also interactively designed, for example, if the teacher pauses at times and prompts her students to think over or reflect over a theory or a concept, the student has already been exposed to a considerable amount of reinforcement and reflection. So when the student comes to class the next day, she is better equipped because they have had an opportunity to not only understand the concept but also reflect on it or explore it further, and has most certainly had time for the concept to sink in. Thus, in a way, the student is mentally ready for extension tasks, discussions, extended assignments on the input, and already at step 3 or step 4. This becomes possible because the student is consistently exposed to the theory or the concept in several different ways after being introduced to it, and every exposure acts as a reinforcement. Consequently, the retention on the part of the student is much more because the concept is getting constantly reinforced. This also offers scope to the teacher to introduce a continuous assessment framework or evaluate the student on certain parameters and study the progress of the student at each of the stages. The teacher is also in a way enabling the student and empowering the student to acquire 21st century skills like digital literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, analytical skills, creativity, communication, collaboration, which have all been identified as the need of the hour and which is what employers are looking for in a possible recruit when they are hiring people. So, in this section, we have compared the traditional classroom approach with the flipped classroom approach, discussed the basics of a flipped classroom, reflected on the advantages of a flipped classroom, looked at the relation between a flipped classroom approach and deep learning and skill building, roughly identified at least one topic that we teach which we can flip.